Photographing the northern lights is a dance between you, your camera settings, and the auroras. Getting optimal photographs of the northern lights requires both proper gear, photographing skills, and persistence. I've been photographing the northern lights for years, and in this video I'll share everything I know about predicting and photographing the auroras. I think it's worth it. Incredible light. I'm literally on top of the world. In this video presentation I will talk about the physics of the auroras and how to predict them fairly precisely. I will talk about how to photograph the auroras and all the practicalities that comes with that. I will talk a bit about the weather, aurora season, light pollution, and what techniques to use and things you need to be aware of while photographing. The northern lights, also known as the Aurora Borealis, and their equatorial opposites, the southern lights, also known as Aurora Australis, are some of the most wondrous natural phenomena. Only in recent years has the technology advanced enough for capturing the full details of these gorgeous displays of heavenly lights on a photograph. For a great many years, photographers had to accept analog film cameras with ISO values not reaching beyond ISO 400, forcing longer shutter speeds to capture the auroras. And that's only the limitations of the camera equipment. Imagine not having neither a car nor a weather or aurora forecast help out hunting the lights, basically relying on pure luck. Modern day cameras and technology has made photographing and filming the auroras a little bit less than impossible. When the constant stream of electrically charged particles from the sun hit the Earth's magnetic field, some of them get trapped. The trapped particles then travel towards the Earth's magnetic poles via the magnetic field lines, leading them down into Earth's atmosphere, where they strike atoms and molecules in a height of about 80 kilometers or above. This interaction releases energy. Some of this energy is seen as the auroras. This constant stream means there's always some interaction going on, which means there's always northern lights. The question is though how big and strong the stream of these particles is. The stronger it is, the bigger the chance of seeing the northern lights. Even on nights without visible northern lights, your camera might be able to pick up a faint green glow. The fluctuations, or basically the strength in the stream of the particles, is measured by the Kp index. The number given is the average global Kp value from the past 3-hour period and thus not a forecast. The 3-hour periods start at midnight at Universal Coordinated Time, formerly known as Greenwich Mean Time, which means the first period is from midnight to 3 am, the second from 3 am to 6 am, and so forth. Using the Kp value as a way of predicting the auroras assumes the activity stays the same, which isn't the best way of predicting anything. Let's imagine you are out at 2:30 am and you're checking the Kp value. The value you have available is the global average from 9 pm to midnight, which doesn't really help you much at 2:30 am. That's why you can have all the sources giving you a Kp6, yet there's no auroras in the sky because the activity has decreased in the meantime, and vice versa. There's some physics and math behind calculating the Kp value, which is of little interest for this video, but the index is scaled from 1 to 9, where 1 is weak and 9 is very strong. Normally the Kp number swings between below 1 and 2, and during periods with higher than normal solar activity the number increases. Higher solar activity is due to huge explosions on the sun's surface spewing out matter into cosmos. Like the Earth, the sun rotates around itself. One Sunday equals to approximately 25 Earth days, making the stream of particles leave the surface of the sun as water leaves a rotating water sprinkler. When one of these explosions, or the remains of one of these explosions, lines up with the Earth, the matter from the sun hits the Earth's magnetic field, increasing the activity in the Earth's atmosphere. During a period with strong geomagnetic activity, as it's rightly called, geomagnetic storms can occur. Geomagnetic storms are measured on the G scale from 1 to 5, which basically translates linearly to the kp scale. G1 equals to kp5, G2 to kp6, and so forth. A G5 storm only happens during extreme events, and it translates into a kp value of 9. During geomagnetic storms, the charged particles are building up in Earth's magnetic field, pushing it further into space, stretching out the magnetotail like a rubber band. When the magnetic field lines reconnect, the energy is released, making a snap back like when you release a rubber band, accelerating the particles back towards Earth with increased velocity and strength, making even stronger aurora displays. This means having a strong enough amount of electrically charged particles hit Earth, some of these particles will create the snapback effect, giving a delayed aurora effect. At weak to moderate activity, the band of auroras around the Earth hovers above Iceland, northern Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and northern Norway. Most auroras occur in a band known as the auroral zone or auroral oval, which is typically 3 to 6 degrees wide in latitude and between 10 to 20 degrees from the geomagnetic poles at all longitudes. The stronger the activity, the further towards south this band is pushed. During the extreme conditions of a KP9, northern lights can be observed as far south as Spain or Florida. The amount of activity on the Sun decreases and increases in what's called solar cycles. These cycles last approximately 11 years. As of 2018, we are on our way towards minimum activity, which should last until 2020, where the activity should increase again. Low activity basically means there's on average further between geomagnetic storms and they're weaker compared to a period of higher activity. That doesn't mean you can't have high aurora activity. Whenever it comes to these measurements and predictions, it's a question about probability. Nothing is set in stone with the auroras. After all, we get most of the data from only one satellite with another as backup. These satellites are stationed in an orbit called the Sun-Earth Lagrange Point 1. This is a point in space which is always located between the Sun and Earth, where the gravity of the Sun and Earth have an equal pull on satellites, meaning they can remain in a stable orbit around this point. Depending on the speed of the solar wind, these satellites can only give us 15 to 16 minutes of warning time before we know what solar wind structures will hit us. So with all the technical stuff out of the way, how do you actually predict when to go and photograph the auroras? I use a few different options, both spaceweatherlive.com and the apps My Aurora Forecast Pro by Jake Ruston and Northern Eye Aurora Forecast. Spaceweatherlive.com is in my opinion the best resource for predicting what I've come across. That is if you understand all the graphs and data. Besides having the most recent KP value, the graph shows the solar wind density, and the BT and BC values of the interplanetary magnetic field, also known as the heliospheric magnetic field, which is a component of the Sun's magnetic field. The first two graphs on the left describes the solar wind. One is for the solar wind speed and one is for the solar wind density. The faster the wind, the harder the charged particles hit the molecules in the atmosphere, resulting in stronger auroras, and the denser the wind is, the more particles hits more molecules, resulting in bigger interaction, resulting in more and stronger auroras. As already stated, depending on the speed of the solar wind, we have more or less time to prepare for the auroras. The turquoise bar tells us that time. The information comes from the right of the graphs, and the black vertical line on top of the graphs represents Earth now. There are two more factors playing in, which you can see on the two graphs on the right: interplanetary magnetic field BT and BC values. The BT value is the strength of the interplanetary magnetic field. The stronger the field, the more magnetism, the more auroras. The average value of the interplanetary magnetic field is 6 nanoteslas. But for geomagnetic storms to occur, you'd like values of at least 10 nanoteslas. The BC value is basically the direction of the interplanetary magnetic field. Since space is three-dimensional, there's also a BX and BY value, but these two doesn't influence auroral activity. When the direction of the interplanetary magnetic field turns southward, the BC value turns negative. This is good, as Earth's magnetic field lines are turned north. As you know from magnetism, north and south poles attract each other, and north or south and south detract each other. When the southbound interplanetary magnetic field meets the northbound magnetosphere of the Earth, they merge, resulting in the transfer of energy, mass and momentum from the solar wind flow to the magnetosphere, transferring all those delicious electrically charged particles towards the poles of the Earth and into our atmosphere. With a northbound interplanetary magnetic field, or positive BC value, auroras are still possible. You just need the other factors, solar wind speed and density, and the BT value to be much higher. During the higher activity periods of the solar cycles, these three values are on average larger. If you're still in doubt, just aim for the colors. Low activity represented by the green color, moderate by the yellow, and high activity by red. And if you want even more information, be sure to hover over the small blue information icon. So these are the factors you need to be aware of in predicting the auroras. It's still impossible to say anything about the behavior of the actual auroras, when exactly they'll appear and precisely where on the night sky you'll see them. But I hope you understood the graphs and how to interpret them, giving you a better chance of predicting when and have the statistically best chance of observing the lights. There's also long-term forecast which goes beyond an hour, but they are a lot more insecure and subject to change, although they are good enough for scheduling your calendar some days in advance. So that's everything I had to say about the space weather. But what about the Earth's weather? Since the auroras happen in an altitude of 80 km or more, and clouds form from sea level to a maximum of 18 kilometers, the clouds will be between you and the auroras. If you have a full cloud cover, you might as well give up. This video being a part of my Iceland series, I normally use the Icelandic and Norwegian weather services to predict the weather. Vidur.is being the Icelandic and yr.no being the Norwegian. The weather predictions from these two services are rarely alike. In my experience, the Norwegian comes out on top, being the best at predicting the weather 60% of the time, although it has been way off before. In general, predicting the weather in Iceland is very hard, even a day in advance, not to mention a week. Local clouds forming on top of mountains are sometimes not taken into consideration by the weather services, but they'll hugely influence your photo. My best advice is to make a general assessment from the weather services and then combine these with your own knowledge and experience to make conclusions. The Icelandic Weather Service have an aurora forecast map where the greens represent clouds and whites clear sky, but this is in my experience sadly not as accurate as I'd wish. In my opinion, a few clouds can be very beneficial to your aurora photos, adding mood and giving a good sense of scale and depth to the scene. The phase of the moon also has a huge impact on the visibility of the northern lights. If the moon is visible in the sky, the reflected light from the sun is scattered in the atmosphere, snuffing out the lights from the auroras. You'll need stronger auroras to compensate for the extra ambient light. Having the moon in the sky helps a great deal on brightening up your foreground. The moon will be more and more present in the first part of the night while waxing. After full moon, it'll rise later and later after sunset, and about a week after full moon, it won't rise until 2 a.m. When new moon comes, it all repeats. I'd say, as a rule of thumb, you would not want to have more than half the moon illuminated to strike a proper balance, preferably something like 30 to 40% illuminated, but that all depends on the strength of the auroras you're seeing and in what direction you're photographing or filming. Light pollution is also a thing. Although you definitely can photograph the auroras above a town or city, the auroras will have to be fairly strong to do so. You will benefit hugely moving away from any source of light pollution. The bigger the source, the further away, just like in regular astrophotography. What's defined as the aurora season is usually between late September and late March. You basically just want as much night as possible, having a wider window and bigger chance of seeing the auroras. The further north or south you get on the Earth, the bigger variety on the length of the day you get dependent on the season. At higher latitudes, the sun won't set at all during summer, making it impossible to watch the faint glow of the auroras. Aurora season is not necessary during winter. Autumn and spring equinoxes work perfectly fine too if you don't want frostbite in your fingers. When the sun is 18 degrees beneath the horizon, it's defined as night, so aim for that. In regard to seeing the colors of the auroras with your own eyes, it's possible, but they'll never be as saturated as your photos from your cameras. This is because our eyes have cones and rods. The cone cells work in bright light such as daylight, while rod cells detect the much fainter light during night, but these only see in black or white and shades of grey. The auroras are more than often simply too faint to be detected by our color detecting cone cells. You will need a high activity aurora storm to detect the colors. Camera sensors doesn't have this limitation. The auroras also change in colors, which is due to what molecules and particles the electrically charged particles interact with in the atmosphere and at what height. So finally we've come to how to photograph the auroras. So first and foremost, you want to bring warm clothes. More than you think you need. Way more. No matter the season. Staying out during night, standing still, coldness fast creeps in on you. Depending on your shooting location, bring waterproof boots. Of course you need your camera and a tripod. Bring extra and charged batteries. Depending on your shooting style, maybe a shutter release cable or remote, a headlamp or a flashlight, and a smartphone as to help you predict the auroras. During cold weather, batteries last shorter. Keep them in your inner pockets close to your skin as to keep them warm. Also cool down your gear before venturing out into a frosty night to avoid condensation. If that's not an option, strap some heat patches on your camera. The same goes for when you bring your camera gear back in. Keep it in your camera bag for a couple of hours or more to avoid condensation. When it comes to the settings, you have to shoot in manual mode as to be able to control your exposure factors. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO and white balance. But first and foremost you will need to focus. Manual focus is a must. For most digital cameras, turn on live view and focus manually on a bright star or object in the distance. Remember to zoom in during live view to see if the star or light is in focus. Most cameras can zoom in to at least ×10. Use your buttons to move around your photo until you've found the light. If you can't see anything, decrease your shutter speed, open your aperture or increase your ISO. If no lights are present whatsoever, it's cloudy and foggy and you can't photograph the northern lights anyway. There's always some distant light available. If you still can't see any lights after zooming in, although you can see stars, remove your lens cap. I've successfully photographed the auroras with a Canon 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, 5DS and Sony a7R III. And I've been using my Sony a6000 for time lapses. When it comes to what camera to use, I'd suggest using one with acceptable noise levels at a minimum of ISO 3200. So we are out here to photograph the auroras and it looks absolutely promising. We have like quarter of a moon to light up the foreground. We have a KP5 prediction, which is actually right now a bit too strong, but we will see how it will go throughout the night. We might need to change the composition a little bit because right now I figured during the day that I would photograph towards the mountains here, but the auroras are actually in that direction. They are so strong. So the thing is, when you want to shoot the auroras, there's a few things you need to factor in. First and foremost, as with all other photography, you want a proper composition. Like just going out into the middle of nowhere and start photographing the auroras. It can be okay if you want to like just stock up on auroras, clean auroras, but else really think about having some kind of interesting foreground. It's, with all other kinds of landscape photography, super important to have some depth in your photo, so you have like foreground, middle ground and background. Not that depth in itself is super important, it's just that it invites the viewer into the frame. So when it comes to gear, first and foremost you would want to have a camera which is good at handling high ISO, which is something like 1600 and beyond. Usually that's full frame cameras. Then you would want to have a fast lens, which means a lens which can go down to an aperture of 2.8 or even lower. For the most part, you would also want to have a wide angle lens, ultra wide angle lens, like let's say just down to 14 millimeter. 16 millimeter is often okay. Right now I'm shooting on a 20 millimeter, and more than often I think it's a bit too narrow. But I do have an aperture of 1.4 to play around with, which is super nice, because the next thing you need to be aware of is that you also want a low shutter speed. So you want a low ISO, a low aperture, simply just to collect as much light as possible. But of course, with the aperture, you also want actually to have it as high as possible, well, like 5.6, to get as sharp as photo as possible. And you would want to have as low a shutter speed as possible, because the auroras move through the night, and if you do a long exposure, the auroras can often become one big green mass of bleh. And the white balance, you can always change that in post-processing if you are photographing in raw formats, which you obviously should, because it's night photography and a lot of things can go wrong. So usually I prefer the colors of the auroras at a color temperature of around 3800, just in that area. So now it's about being dark enough, and we will go scout the area. Luckily we are at Easterhorn right now, and this is just like a playground for landscape photographers. There are so many possibilities for strong foregrounds, and you have the mountains as the background or the sky as the background, and you have the middle ground with the water or some cliffs or whatever you can find. Like, there's so many possibilities here. So right now you can see just here above me, we are in for a treat tonight. This is just absolutely incredible. So right now I'm shooting with ISO 32,000 and an aperture of 1.4 and a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. And you can actually see the auroras, and you can see the lighthouse here in the background. It is just incredible. This night is going to just blow out of proportions. So yeah, I can't wait to get started. Just look at this. I'm too excited for this. When you've attached your camera to your tripod, turn off steady shot, vibration compensation, image stabilization, or whatever your camera manufacturer calls it, as this will actually shake your photo, blurring your picture. Also turn off long exposure noise decreasing or compensation, as this function basically takes another photo, putting it on top of your original photo, averaging out the noise. Problem being, the auroras will move, resulting in blurred auroras. And I'd also suggest having a proper and sturdy tripod which doesn't shake during windy conditions. In regard to the settings, I'd suggest starting out with the following. Start out with an ISO of 1600, aperture of f2.8 or lower, and a 10-second shutter speed. The strength of the aurora can vary a lot, also within a very short time span, where you have to change your settings fast as to not over or underexpose your photo. And this is the hardest part of photographing the auroras, nailing the exposure. Use your histogram, preferably RGB histogram, as to keep an eye on the green channel, as this has a tendency to easily overexpose. Don't ever rely on your display, you simply can't trust it. There really aren't any standard settings for photographing the auroras. There are simply too many varying factors involved. As I started out by saying, photographing the auroras is a dance between you, your camera, and the auroras. The best you can do is to know your camera. Know where the buttons are located, as to be able to change settings fast in the dark, and how much you can push the ISO as to not get too much grain. You also have to take the depth of field into consideration. If you, as I, photograph at f1.4 at 20mm, the first 10 meters in front of the camera will be out of focus if I focus on infinity. This highly influenced my composition and the techniques I use to make my photos. Having a foreground closer to the camera than 10 meters, I have to either stop down the aperture or focus stack the photo. Other techniques to consider beside focus stacking are image blending, where you make one exposure for the sky and the auroras and one exposure for the foreground, and then blend them in the post-processing. You can also blend in the sky with a daytime photo, or even, as I've done in the past, make composites of nighttime photos, daytime photos, or blue hour photos. In regard to composition, you can use the same tools as I've already made several videos about: focal point, leading lines, balance, etc. Be sure to check out my videos on composition. As stated the night we were at Aurora, I scouted out the composition in daylight. It comes highly recommended to find your composition before it gets too dark, since determining what kind of composition that works in the dark can be next to nearly impossible. I started out photographing the path leading up to the lighthouse, but my goal was to photograph the auroras behind the mountains of Aurora. I found the composition with the waves in front leading up to the mountains to be the most desirable that night, and with the moon being about 40% illuminated, it lit up the foreground perfectly. When I got the photos I wanted from the position, I left the position and went for a walk up the beach to get a more optimal angle lining the mountains up with the auroras. With this moderate to high active display of auroras, the most active part of the sky was often straight above our heads. When that's the case, you will see the auroras stretching from east to west and not towards the north, as you will see in the lower latitudes like Scotland and Denmark. The direction of the auroras obviously highly influence your composition, and you will have to take this into consideration when preparing. During the night, the auroras exploded again and again, making it the most active night I had in Iceland this winter. Sadly, I didn't get anything as strong as I got in Lofoten back in November, but from what I've learned, that's also a rare event. I managed to catch a few more photos before the auroras died down, and Nigel and I decided to call it a night. But as it goes with the auroras most often, the second you decide to pack up, they reignite. Almost back at Høb, we got another fantastic display. I can happily announce I released my first buyable post-processing tutorial. Here I show how I make my Aurora composites. I talk composition and techniques on how to seamlessly blend the different photos and edit them. The auroras are an absolutely spectacular phenomena. Nothing really compares to seeing these magnificent lights wave over the night sky. To many people it's a hugely existential and addictive experience. Researching this video has taught me a great deal on auroras. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something. So thank you very much for watching, and if you're interested in my post-processing techniques, be sure to check out the link in the description below.